In the early 1950s, the commercial aviation industry stood on the edge of its most disruptive transition since the introduction of the DC-3. Turbojet propulsion, proven in military service, promised higher cruise speeds, longer ranges, and entirely new route economics. Boeing recognized this shift earlier than any other American manufacturer. In 1952, the company committed internal funds to what would become the Model 367-80, later known simply as the Dash 80. Officially a prototype, it was in reality a full-scale technology demonstrator designed to prove that jet transport could be reliable, profitable, and scalable. By its first flight in July 1954, Boeing engineers had already validated swept-wing aerodynamics, podded engine layouts, and high-altitude pressurization concepts that airlines would soon demand. Douglas Aircraft Company watched these developments with caution. Throughout the mid-1950s, Douglas leadership remained focused on maximizing returns from the DC-6 and DC-7, aircraft that still sold well and dominated long-range piston operations. Internal planning documents from 1954 and 1955 show concern that jet fuel consumption, runway length requirements, and maintenance complexity would limit early adoption. Douglas believed airlines would transition gradually, first through turboprops, then to jets. This conservative assessment delayed a firm commitment to a jet transport until mid-1955, when airline pressure became impossible to ignore. While Douglas debated, Boeing moved. Pan American World Airways under John Tripp was searching for an aircraft capable of redefining international travel. Boeing's willingness to fly a full-scale prototype, invite airline executives into the cockpit, and adapt designs around customer feedback proved decisive. In October 1955, Pan Am announced its intention to order the 707, followed closely by a parallel order for the Douglas DC-8 as a hedge. But the damage was already done. Boeing had seized mindshare and momentum. The jet age in the public imagination was already associated with the 707. By the time the DC-8 program formally launched in 1957, airline procurement strategies had hardened. Fleets were no longer abstract ideas. Training programs, maintenance bases, and route expansions were being planned around specific aircraft dimensions, weights, and performance envelopes. Boeing capitalized on this by offering multiple 707 variants early, tailoring range and capacity to different carriers. Orders from Pan Am, TWA, American, National, and Continental accumulated rapidly. By 1958, Boeing held well over 100 firm commitments, many tied to long-term growth plans extending into the 1960s. The DC-8 first flew in May 1958, just months before the 707 entered revenue service, but the timing obscured a deeper structural lag. Boeing had spent nearly 4 years refining its jet in flight, accumulating operational knowledge and airline trust. Douglas, by contrast, was still validating basic assumptions. Certification proceeded smoothly, but market positioning did not. Airlines evaluating the DC-8 were no longer choosing between concepts. They were being asked to reverse decisions already made. First-mover advantage compounded across the industry. Airlines that introduced the 707 standardized crew training, simulator procurement, and spare parts logistics around Boeing systems. Dispatch reliability improved rapidly as fleets grew, reinforcing confidence in the type. Route maps from 1959 and 1960 show the 707 dominating transatlantic crossings, transcontinental U.S. services, and early Pacific operations. The aircraft became the default solution for jet expansion, not because it was flawless, but because it was available first and in numbers. Douglas faced additional constraints on the factory floor. Long Beach production emphasized structural robustness and incremental testing, priorities shaped by decades of piston airliner experience. This ensured durability, but limited early output rates. Boeing, backed by defense contracts and accustomed to high-volume military production, scaled its Renton lines aggressively. Photographs from the period show multiple 707 airframes in various stages of completion, while DC-8s emerged at a steadier, more deliberate pace. For airlines chasing growth, availability mattered as much as performance. By 1960, the competitive landscape had hardened. Carriers interested in the DC-8 often operated mixed fleets, but few were willing to shift entirely. The cost of switching grew with every additional 707 delivered. Training, spares, and operational procedures created inertia that favored the incumbent. Douglas was no longer competing on a clean slate. It was fighting uphill against decisions made years earlier. The result was not immediate failure, but a permanent disadvantage. The DC-8 entered a market already shaped by Boeing's assumptions, Boeing's timelines, and Boeing's scale. It would spend the rest of its commercial life reacting to that reality. By the time the DC-8 arrived, Boeing had not just sold airplanes, it had sold airlines a future they were already living in. The initial DC-8 design, finalized in 1952, featured a fuselage diameter of 12 feet 4 inches, just wide enough to accommodate 6 abreast seating with a 3-3 layout. This narrow cross-section was considered adequate for domestic carriers such as United, Eastern, and American, who were the target customers at the time. However, this early choice limited flexibility for higher capacity variants without a full redesign. In contrast, Boeing had opted for a 12-foot 6-inch fuselage on the 707, allowing more room for incremental expansion while maintaining type continuity. Structural decisions further constrained growth. Douglas engineers emphasized a robust wing spar and minimal use of weight-saving composites, prioritizing proven aluminum alloys and load-bearing redundancy. The result was a sturdy airplane that could endure repeated cycles of pressurization without significant fatigue issues, but it carried additional structural weight that restricted later stretch attempts. Boeing, meanwhile, had begun experimenting with modular fuselage plugs and wing box designs that could accommodate incremental lengthening with fewer penalties, giving the 707 the potential to evolve into multiple variants without restarting certification. When the DC-8 entered service in 1959, airlines immediately noted its smooth ride, reliable systems, and relatively low maintenance demands. Nevertheless, the conservative engineering choices meant that any significant increase in seating capacity or range required complex redesigns, not simple modifications. For instance, the DC-8-62 and DC-8-63, introduced in the mid-1960s, required substantial wing modifications, higher thrust engines, and reinforced landing gear to stretch the aircraft from its original 135 to 150 seat layout to 180 to 189 seats. These efforts were costly, time-consuming, and delayed market response, allowing Boeing to cement dominance with the 707-320 Intercontinental Series, which had already captured airline orders for longer routes. Douglas's cautious approach extended to engines and systems. The early DC-8s used the Pratt & Whitney turbojet JT3C, later upgraded to JT4A for higher thrust, but each change involved extensive structural evaluation and recertification. Boeing's 707s had already transitioned to low-bypass turbofans by the early 1960s, with fewer integration penalties, highlighting the flexibility gap. Avionics and cockpit layouts followed a similar pattern. The DC-8's design left little room for standardization across variants, forcing airlines to train crews separately for each model, while Boeing's modular cockpit philosophy allowed cross-qualification, reducing operating costs. Commercially, this conservatism had consequences. Airlines seeking growth on transcontinental and intercontinental routes often preferred the 707 family because its potential for stretching, higher payloads, and engine upgrades offered a path to scale without full fleet replacement. Douglas, constrained by early decisions, was forced into reactive engineering and slower rollout schedules. Despite achieving excellent reliability and performance, the DC-8 could not match Boeing's versatility and operate a family of aircraft that evolved alongside airline network demands. In essence, Douglas had engineered a solid, safe airplane. The DC-8 excelled in operational reliability, passenger comfort, and structural durability, but in an era when first-mover advantage, variant scalability, and modularity were becoming decisive, its conservative assumptions and structural conservatism meant that every stretch, upgrade, or extended range model required disproportionate effort. The framing line became increasingly apt among aviation historians. Douglas built a good airplane. Boeing built a family. The contrast in corporate design philosophy, reactive versus proactive, would dictate market perception and ultimately shape the competitive landscape for decades to come. By 1964, the commercial jet market had shifted dramatically. Boeing's 707-320 Intercontinental and 720 models were selling in volumes Douglas could barely match. Airlines such as Pan American, Eastern, and Delta were placing repeat orders for longer-range 707s, while simultaneously requesting higher capacity jets for expanding transatlantic and Pacific routes. Douglas faced mounting pressure. The original DC8-30 variant seated just 150 to 170 passengers, leaving airlines demanding upgrades capable of 180 to 200 seats without sacrificing range. The requests came with tight delivery schedules, threatening to erode Douglas's market credibility. Reacting under this pressure, Douglas initiated the DC8-61 stretch program in 1965. Engineers had to insert a 10-foot fuselage plug, reinforcing the center wing box and modifying landing gear to handle the additional weight. The modifications also required uprated Pratt & Whitney JT4A-3 engines and structural testing at Douglas's Long Beach facilities, all under accelerated timelines. Each redesign cycle cost millions of dollars, straining Douglas's already tight balance sheet. Unlike Boeing, which had anticipated modular upgrades, Douglas had to perform near ground-up engineering for every capacity expansion. The DC-8-62, optimized for intercontinental routes, added fuel tanks, extended wing trailing edges, and increased tail surfaces, further compounding development costs and delaying revenue recognition. Financially, the company teetered. By mid-1966, Douglas's commercial division reported expenditures on stretch programs exceeding 25% of projected annual revenue. Investors grew nervous, and management faced internal debates on whether to continue with commercial jets or pivot more heavily into military contracts and missile programs. Airlines were growing impatient, threatening to divert future orders to Boeing or Lockheed. The DC-8's fate hung in balance. A failure to deliver timely, higher-capacity models could have forced Douglas out of the jetliner business entirely. The contrast was stark. The 707 family's incremental stretches, the 707-320B and 707-420 with advanced JT4A and RB163 engines, had already captured long-haul markets, providing airlines with immediate capacity gains and reduced per-seat costs. Douglas, in contrast, was forced to evolve reactively, constrained by earlier conservative choices in fuselage diameter and structural weight distribution. Aviation analysts later noted, Douglas didn't evolve early, it was forced to evolve fast. The period between 1964 and 1967 became a defining moment. Survival depended on executing complex redesigns flawlessly while preserving delivery schedules, costs, and customer confidence. The DC-8's eventual comeback began with the introduction of the DC-8-61 and DC-8-63 series. By 1967, the 61 stretched fuselage allowed 180 to 189 passengers in a two-class layout, while the 63 added extra fuel tanks for trans-Pacific range, giving airlines operational flexibility comparable to the 707-320B without sacrificing payload. Pratt & Whitney JT4A-9 engines, coupled with reinforced landing gear and wing modifications, elevated maximum takeoff weight to 315,000 pounds, extending range to 4,100 nautical miles for the 63 variant. Douglas had effectively converted a design originally constrained by conservative assumptions into a competitive platform capable of meeting airline demands for longer, higher-density routes. Cargo conversions played a critical role in extending the DC-8's lifespan. Beginning in the 1970s, FedEx, UPS, and other freight carriers began acquiring retired passenger DC-8s using stretched freighter variants to transport 40,000 to 50,000 pounds per flight over medium and long-haul routes. Many DC-8s remained in operational service into the early 2000s, some exceeding 40 years of continuous service, an extraordinary achievement for a first-generation commercial jet. Operational reliability, redundant systems, and durable airframe construction allowed the DC-8 to quietly outperform competitors in niche cargo markets, often outlasting Boeing's earlier jets in the same role. The DC-8's success was measured not in headline market domination, but in adaptability. Although initially cornered by Boeing's first-mover advantage and modular thinking, Douglas's program demonstrated that careful engineering, disciplined redesign, and persistent market alignment could preserve relevance.